Welcome to this lecture on understanding objects in iBooks Author. Now, an object in iBooks Author is any item that you place on a page in your book. So that could include photos, images, widgets, which might be interactive media, shapes, text boxes, tables, charts. Those are all examples of objects in iBooks Author. And there are three types of objects. We have inline objects, floating, and anchored objects. So let's go ahead and add an object to our book. And what we'll do is we'll actually take a little image of the Statue of Liberty, and I'm going to drag and drop it into our book. And you can see that the object, when it comes in, it's basically a floating object. And as I'm moving it around, the text is flowing around it. And I can bring up my inspector and I can go into the wrap inspector, and it'll actually show me whether this is an inline, floating, or anchored object. So an inline object is embedded in the text flow and it moves with the text. So for example, if we were to add a paragraph here, so let's just add it here. You can see that as I'm adding additional line breaks, that image is moving with the content because it is an inline object. The other option that we have is to make this a floating object. So what happens when it's a floating object is that it's fixed to a particular position on a page. So we can drag this floating object anywhere that we want, and the text simply wraps around the object. And you can see that when we have the option for an object to be a floating object, we have the option to either allow it to cause wrap or not to cause wrap. If I was to deselect that, you can see just sitting on top of my content. If I turn on wrap, then I can choose how it interacts with the text around it. So in most cases, you're going to want to wrap the text around the object, but certainly you can also choose a different option for wrapping the text either to the left or the right, or whichever side has more space, or even above and below the object. You can also choose how the text actually fits around the object, and you can add additional space. So for example, maybe I want more space. You can see that as I'm increasing that, it's actually creating more white space around my object for the text. So by default, when you add objects in iBooks Author, they're either anchored or they're floating. But as you can see, we can use the text inspector and very easily turn those into inline objects. The other thing that you should know is that inline objects and most widgets will always appear in both landscape and portrait orientation. But the floating and anchored objects, they behave differently depending on the kind of template that you use. So if you are planning on using a lot of anchored or floating objects in your text, you probably just want to check to see how they appear in portrait mode before you get too far down the road. Again, you have the option of removing the portrait orientation altogether, so you don't have to worry about how text renders in portrait mode or how your objects render in portrait mode then. So what happens for the most part when you have a landscape with portrait template is that floating and anchored objects are actually going to be hidden when a reader rotates the device to portrait orientation. So in this example, this Statue of Liberty is actually not going to show up in the portrait view at all. If we want this object to show up in the portrait view, we can make it an inline object. That means that it will display in the portrait view as well. Or the other thing that we can do is we can give it a title or a caption. So the way that we can do that is we can go into the widget inspector and we can add a title. And we can make this, we can call this the Statue of Liberty. So now that we've added a title, we could have also added a caption. Now that that's in place, this will appear in the portrait view in the margins. So that way the reader has the option of tapping on that thumbnail and seeing a larger view of this particular object. Now, if you're using a portrait orientation or portrait only template, then floating and anchored objects will always appear. So what you see is what you get with the portrait templates, but the landscape with portrait, just keep in mind that objects do tend to shift depending on whether they're inline, anchored, or floating. And that concludes this lecture on objects in iBooks Author.